And why would we want to give any group of billionaires or oligarchs or NGOs or governments the ability to destroy and possibly really harm life on the entire planet because of some mythology that they adhere to? And I say it's mythology. We talked about the idea of neo-malthusianism and the carrying capacity of the Earth. What these people always miss in their mythology is the inventive capacity of the human mind.
In November, the United Nations will be staging the COP27 Climate Change Conference in Egypt. In anticipation of the event, they released what they called the Human Development Report 2021-2022. In it, they dwell on what they call the Anthropocene era, or the era of man-made climate change. The document calls for us to be more ecocentric. In reading that, one won't fail to feel that the leaders are more egocentric than ecocentric. And here to talk to us today about their plans of geoengineering the planet is publisher for the New American Magazine, Dennis Behreandt. Thanks for stopping by, Dennis.
Thanks, Daniel. Glad to talk with you today.
Yeah, I wanted to discuss with you because we had had great discussions on your book, Endgame, where you talk about the plan going forward for some of the globalists, or you might call them mercantilists as well, where they basically want to do, they called themselves back in the 70s neo-malthusians. Like, for instance, Henry Kissinger, he said that he put out a policy paper, a memo, and it was NSSM 200. And he talked about it was critical for the United States' strategic path going forward to make sure that third world countries don't have large population increases because they might use their natural resources on their own citizens for the good of their own people, and that they had to keep the populations low. So to make sure that that didn't happen, Kissinger said that we had to enact population control methodologies in 13 countries, and I have a list here of those countries. It was the Philippines, Thailand, Turkey, Ethiopia, Colombia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Mexico, and Egypt, where the COP27 conference is going to be taking place, ironically. So I wanted to start off, in discussing geoengineering, I wanted to start off with asking you about their Malthusian ideas and, how that's affecting the whole, kind of green initiative thing.
Yeah, well, the basic Malthusian idea is that food supply does not increase at the same rate that the population increases, and thus we will have increasing likelihood of starvation and mass death. But that has, in the modern era, been expanded beyond the idea of just food supplies, but to resources in general, and in the ecological sense that is used, the carrying capacity of the environment in which we exist, which, of course, is the whole planet. So the carrying capacity of the planet is thought in neo-Malthusian terms as not sufficiently capable of increasing to support a rapidly increasing human population. If you believe this, if this is your position, then you inescapably arrive at the conclusion that you must eliminate or somehow manage otherwise the population of people on the planet in order to be able to be in conformity with available resources, which leads to another conclusion that someone must be empowered to do that management. So out the window then goes, as a result of this thinking, any idea of individual autonomy. The individual can no longer be autonomous. Someone must manage that individual, perhaps even down to whether or not that individual lives, and if they live, how they live. So we're really talking about the inescapable conclusion, if you are a neo-Malthusian, that there must be some sort of tyrannical, totalitarian, technocratic managerial control over every aspect of human life. And that, I would argue, is the animating principle behind the United Nations climate change meetings that they have every year, COP27 coming up next in Egypt, as you note. I think that is the overarching philosophical, logical framework under which all of the participants of these meetings take place, and under which the framework is developed for the future management under the UN agenda for all of the world's population, as well as all of the economic activity, personal and corporate, that takes place on the planet in whatever nation. So this is not just confined to one nation, but all nations. And we're really looking at the rationale for thoroughgoing worldwide totalitarian control on the basis of trying to limit human activity to keep it in line with what is perceived to be the carrying capacity of the environment.
Yeah, as an adjunct of the upcoming conference, I've been reading that report, the Human Development Report 2021-2022, and it outlines four methodologies to control the planet, to control the populations, and they say one is traumatizing events. Two, physical illness like viruses. Three, general climate anxiety like hurricanes and things that might pertain to geoengineering. For food security, right? So if people are nervous about food, whether it's supply chains collapsing or whether it's new GMOs or them encouraging people to eat insects, this all causes anxiety that leads to the paralysis of the populations that allows them to more easily manage the populations. And the whole thing, without saying it, kind of reminded me of Alvin Toffler's book, Future Shock. Future Shock was released in 1970, and he talks about neurosis being instigated by the rapid pace of change. And he talks about, like changes that would have taken 500 years in the past are done within a single lifetime now. Like, for instance, the changing of pronouns, the changing of, sexuality and identity, and in his book, he talks about. Let me see if I can find a quote from Future Change, and I'm going by my little notes here. I apologize. It says, in 1965, in an article in Horizon, I coined the term future shock to describe the shattering stress and disorientation that we induce in individuals by subjecting them to too much change in too short a time. First, it became clear that future shock is no longer a distantly potential danger, but a real sickness from which increasingly large numbers already suffer. This psychobiological condition can be described in medical and psychiatric terms. It is the disease of change. And so, what is interesting about this document is they actually call it Human Development Report, Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Our Future in a Transforming World. So it's basically a way to trigger future shock in people. And one of those things, as I said, is geoengineering. And that kind of comes up. I sent you, Dennis, a video purporting to show that the recent Hurricane Ian might have been manipulated. And I wanted to get your take on that. Whether the possibility exists for them to manipulate hurricanes to instigate these stress situations to kind of pacify and paralyze the populace.
Well, I think that there have been research attempts and even practical attempts to modify weather going back even to the 1960s. There were efforts to understand how to do weather modification, for instance, to create conditions within the conflict in Vietnam that would be advantageous to the American side and disadvantageous to the communist side. Question is whether or not these things were effective or not. However, they were attempts that were made, and they were research attempts that were instigated, and there continue to be research attempts on this. So whether or not Hurricane Ian was created and or steered or in other ways managed by some sort of weather modification capacity, I don't know whether or not it was. I can't say one way or the other. I don't have any information that confirms or denies it. However, we can say for sure that there are people who are interested in that subject, just as they are interested in the broader subject of geoengineering as a whole. And we see increasing numbers of references to really dangerous geoengineering initiatives that are being proposed to moderate the climate. We see repeated conversations coming out of the Bill and Melinda Gates organization, promoted by Bill Gates in particular, to place into space or otherwise into the atmosphere means by which you could limit the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface. Of course, the idea being that, well, we're getting too much solar radiation, so let's block that out and cool down the Earth. This is something that would affect every person on the planet, and so you have to ask whether or not any group or person who is proposing that plan should have the power to make that plan take place, because you're giving that person or that group or that government or that NGO the power to disrupt all life on Earth without any control over them. And that is, well, I think the definition of insanity, as well as just repugnant to anyone who is, for instance, specifically an American who believes that we come out of a realm of no taxation without representation. Well, how about no destroying the planet without representation? Because you don't know what the unintended consequences of such a geoengineering intervention might be. And I think chances are that that intervention would be potentially disastrous. And why would we want to give any group of billionaires or oligarchs or NGOs or governments the ability to destroy and possibly really harm life on the entire planet because of some mythology that they adhere to? And I say it's mythology. We talked about the idea of neo-malthusianism and the carrying capacity of the earth. What these people always miss in their mythology is the inventive capacity of the human mind. And this is something the great economist Julian Simon wrote about at length until he passed away. The books in question that he wrote on this subject, first Ultimate Resource and then his follow-up Ultimate Resource 2. And Julian Simon's whole thesis was, you have all these people thinking and inventing and looking at ways in which within the market economy they can improve the products and services that they deliver. And he was really going forward on the idea of the invisible hand from Adam Smith, that they don't intend necessarily the improvement of the entire human race or the planet as a whole. They only seek to benefit themselves by engaging in more inventive and collaborative exchange with others. But in pursuing this, they improve everyone's lives. And so we have this massive inventive capacity, and we've seen it time after time after time. It's why there are far fewer poor people today than there were in the 18th century, for instance. There are far fewer people starving today than there were in the 18th century, when starvation and famine were common. We've invented better ways to feed people. We've invented new means of agriculture. We've invented better supply chains. And these things continue to get better unless they're interfered with. And when we talk about geoengineering, we're talking about massive levels of interference. And whenever we have artificially generated interference in the economic activity in the market system, you have discontinuities that occur that drive all sorts of problems and chaos, which we're seeing demonstrated in our lives today in the wake of the COVID pandemic and all of its ridiculous lockdowns. These things cause all sorts of discontinuities in production and distribution and supply chain that we are still dealing within shortages of food, shortages of semiconductors, shortages of raw materials, shortages of fuels, inability to transport these things, and current and future further interruptions in these things, for instance, because of the war in Ukraine, are only exacerbating the problem. So let's expand that to the big scale at geoengineering. Can you just about imagine what discontinuities and unintended effects of that level of intervention might cause? We need to think about this in Julian Simon's terms and not in the neo-Malthusian terms.
Yeah, well, you mentioned disruptions, and I just wanted to kind of go back just for a second to what you mentioned at the beginning regarding geoengineering and the kind of hubris, the idea that they want to control weather as a method of controlling nations, the same way they want to control energy to control nations. And you have that 1962 clip of Lyndon B. Johnson saying that whoever controls weather controls the world.
And ultimately, to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
And he was talking about, government projects back then in the early 60s to control the stratosphere and do, kind of cloud seeding and stuff like that. And this goes into the whole, kind of controversy about chemtrails and are they seeding metals up into the sky so that H.A.A.R.P, facilities can, manipulate, like magnetically manipulate weather patterns and stuff, to propel, as an example, a hurricane in a particular direction. But you also mentioned disruptions. And so the document that they released, in the lead up to their climate change conference in November talks about instigating disruptions on purpose to kind of, destabilize the populace. And it just reminded me, one of the things here, and I'm going to read this note to myself. One of the things in here, I mentioned before, the 4 things that they mentioned to control the populace: traumatizing events, physical illness, general climate change anxiety, and food insecurity. And they kind of come off like a mafia button man and like a racketeering threat, And it goes, the 4 principles can also have their own internal tensions. Building systems with some stabilizing redundancies, for example, needs to be balanced against nimble response capacities. Still, it is hard to be quick on one's feet if one is constantly getting knocked over by a financial meltdown, novel virus, or monster hurricane. So it kind of just reminded me of like, oh, nice country you have there. It'd be a pity if anything happened to it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the first thing that we all have to think about is whether or not we should allow these types of proposals to be debated in the dark. And most Americans are insulated from knowledge of what the United Nations is doing. They'll hear about the conferences happening, but very little about what actually takes place at that conference, unless maybe or until some sort of actual treaty comes out of it that ends up having to go to the Senate for debate. But most of this, the things that happen at these conferences are in order to align non-governmental organizations with international bodies like the UN and its subsidiary organizations, and then to flow that alignment into the corporate sector so that all of these things are aligned right on down without any kind of government treaty taking place. So this kind of alignment is what these conferences are all about, and it takes place in the dark. The average person has no idea, and yet their lives are affected by it. Concrete example of this, we have states now reacting to ESG, rules of investing, coming from places like BlackRock. Well, ESG didn't occur in a vacuum. ESG occurs as part of alignment with sustainable development goals that are traced right up to Agenda 2030, which is the UN program. So these things do impact directly the lives of people through these alignments that take place as a result of these conferences. But getting back to my key point, these conferences take place without most people understanding what's going on within them, and that's where the New American Magazine comes in. And Daniel, you're going to be part of this. You're going to be in our studio as part of our studio team providing in-studio coverage of the upcoming climate conference in Egypt, but it's why we are sending a team of journalists from the New American to Egypt to cover that conference, to report on what's taking place at the conference, so that the American citizens and others around the world who should need to know about this and may want to know about this, if they want to find out what's happening, they can come to the New American Magazine, and our team of journalists and you as part of our in-studio team, Daniel, will be reporting on what's going on at Sharm el-Sheikh, and people will get an attempt to understand what's taking place and how that's going to affect their lives downstream. And it's an important task that I'm happy that we at the New American can help provide access to this information for the American people.
Okay, awesome. And with that, I'd like to thank Dennis Behreandt for stopping by and sharing his thoughts with us. And I am going to be co-hosting coverage of the conference coming up in November. And so you can see live streaming of that event with our journalists that are going to be sent out to Egypt on the week of Tuesday, November 15th. And I hope to see you guys there. And I'd like to thank you for stopping by and watching this great interview with Dennis. And I'd like to thank Dennis and everyone else. And I will see you guys on the 15th of November.